Thank you so much for coming, everyone. It's a really special evening. I'm delighted to welcome you here to the Outsider Art Fair New York's panel discussion. My name is Nikki Jacobella. I'm the director of the New York Fair. Thank you so much to Ace Hotel for hosting us in this super cool room. We love it. Before I introduce the moderator, I just want to take a couple of minutes just to tell you about this edition of the Outsider Art Fair. It's a really special one in so many ways. Firstly, we're back in an in-person fair at the Metropolitan Pavilion. We open tomorrow, Thursday, March 4th, and we run through till Sunday the 6th, Sunday, March 6th. Not only that, we also turned 30. It's our 30th edition, so this is really time to party. So we'll hope you come to the fair and join us for that. We have 65 exhibitors, as well as 4 exceptional curated spaces, which I really encourage you to take a look at and take your time when you do come and visit. One of these curated projects revolves around this talk, Field Trip Psychedelic Solution from 1986 to 1995. As a lot of you know, Psychedelic Solution operated in the West Village from 1986 to 2004, and it was the first exhibition space devoted to historical and contemporary expressions of psychedelic art. So we're really going to delve into that this evening. Nicole Rudick, to my right, the moderator, she will kick things off, but I just would like to introduce you to her first. She is the author of what is now known, was once only forgotten, an autobiography of Nikki D. Samphal. It was published recently, like February. Yeah, great. She is also the editor of a new edition of Gary Panter's comic Jimbo, Adventures in Paradise, and of the writer's chapbook, a compendium of fact, opinion, wit, and advice from the Paris Review interviews. Nicole's writing has also appeared in the New York Review of Books, T Magazine, and Book Forum. She was the managing editor of the Paris Review for nearly a decade as well. Thank you so much, Nicole. Take it away. Thank you, everyone.
Welcome. Thank you all for joining us. I'll do some brief introductions before we get started, if I can get on the stool. So, let's see. In the center, we have Jacaeber Kastor, who owned and ran the legendary... Yes. The reason we're here tonight. He ran the legendary Psychedelic Solution Gallery in New York's West Village from 1986 to 2004, where he exhibited the work of numerous artists, including Rick Griffin, Alton Kelly, Victor Moscoso, Robert Williams, and Mark Mothersbaugh. A correspondent for the British magazine Zigzag in the 1980s, Kastor also wrote for Off the Wall in the 1990s, and most recently for Juxtapoz. His extensive collection of psychedelic art is the subject of the exhibition Field Trip, Psychedelic Solution, 1986 to 1995, on view in the art fair. Fred Tomaselli, on the far right, is a New York-based artist whose paintings draw on art historical sources as well as Eastern and Western traditions. His work has most recently been the subject of exhibitions at the Jocelyn Art Museum in Omaha, Nebraska, Oceanside Museum of Art, California, White Cube in London, and the Toledo Museum of Art in Ohio. And he's been included in international biennials, including Sydney, Prospect One, Site Santa Fe, and the Whitney Museum of American Art. He is the curator of the exhibition Field Trip, Psychedelic Solution, on view. And Dan Nadel, on the left. He's curator at large for the Manetti Shrem Museum of Art at UC Davis. His most recent books include Peter Soul, Professional Artist Correspondence, 1945 to 1976, and It's Life as I See It, Black Cartoonist in Chicago, 1940 to 1980, which accompanied his exhibition at the Museum of Contemporary Art, Chicago. That was called Chicago Comics, 1960 to now. And he's currently at work on a biography of Robert Crumb. So by talking about what psychedelic art is and what it includes. So, Jacaeber, the term psychedelic art, the sort of category encompasses so many different kinds of work. It's quite broad and far-reaching, vernacular forms from all over the world, and a variety of material from yarn paintings, acid blotter paper, comics, posters, in addition to more traditional forms of painting and drawing. And it's also not confined to a particular era. You have, in your own collection, the earliest work I think is from 1900, and it goes all the way up to the present day. So how do you begin to think about what constitutes psychedelic art? What can be put under that category, and sort of what sorts of things they have in common?
Well, that's a question that obviously I've had to deal with a lot over the years, so my thinking on it's gradually distilled. But I like to keep it as simple as possible and as broad as possible. So my basic definition is simply art that owes something to the psychedelic experience. And that's as few words as I can get it down to. And I think that leaves it open to interpretation.
You said that it's not just LSD that you're thinking of, but a whole variety of...
Sure, there's the known psychedelic substances, and then there's probably unknown ones, including things within ourselves that may... We have the psychedelic, I believe, inside ourselves. You know, it's... I don't know that one has to necessarily imbue, you know, intake some substance specifically to have a psychedelic experience. But the bottom line is that the art owes something to an experience. In terms of classifying it as an art category, it's art that owes something to an experience. It's, you know, not necessarily art that's done during a certain period of time or has a certain type of technique, or there was a group of people that did a manifesto or something and said, we're about this, we're not about that. It's like...
So then how do you start to make sense of all of the work that does fall under that very broad?
Well, like you would with a large meal, you don't take it all in one gulp, you know? You cut off a piece that, you know, suits you. It's a large field, and you can look at it in terms that you're interested in. For whatever reason, you might want to dissect it. It's not like if I was to say God. How do you talk about God? How do you, parse God? I mean, it's a big subject. So I'd say it's just a question of, working with whatever part you're concerned with. Either what you're exposed to, or what you have access to, or what interests you, or, you take it a bit at a time, and then people's comprehension as to what it all may be grows, organically.
When we were talking the other day, you used the term qualia to think about what might be considered psychedelic art. Can you talk a little bit about that term? Because I found it very clarifying.
Yeah. Well, qualia has to do with our unique experiencing of certain things that are they're personal experiences we have that you can't necessarily share them or transmit them, but yet they're universally understood at times. I think one example they often use is like we all kind of know what the taste of an orange is, but yet we experience it individually. So what a psychedelic experience may be is to some extent pretty unique. I mean, it's not that we can't talk about it and share ideas and such, but I take 100 mics of LSD, I'm going to have a different experience than Fred has. And we might be able to talk about it or whatever, but it's not going to be the same experience. So it's interesting to try to discuss something that there's a commonality involved, and yet there's a specific individual that is unique and can't necessarily be shared. So there's a personal element to it.
Does it seem fair to say that psychedelic art is about the experience, whereas art that falls, I guess all other kinds of art is maybe about, for instance, sort of a belief about experience, that there's that direct expression of experience in psychedelic art?
That's an interesting question. Well, to some extent, yeah. I mean, it could be. I don't like to limit things, but it could be about experience. It also may just be the experience affected you, and it's not necessarily about your experience. It may be just that you were experienced, as Jimi Hendrix might have put it. Have you been experienced? You may decide just to, in a crude way of putting it, just go back to your regular life and you're interested in pet portraits or something. But you've been affected, and maybe your pet portraits have some little tinge of something that had to do with your change in your overall grasp of the perceptions. Maybe it opened up some things, and you have more, detail of the hairs or something, or you have like a little bit of light. You see light differently. It's not necessarily it is not limited to specifically about the experience. A lot of psychedelic art is about the experience, but it doesn't have to be. It's just the fact that you have had the experience and maybe it's changed you. There's people that I would say do not characterize their art as psychedelic. And that's an interesting issue too, because they're like, my art's not about psychedelics whatsoever. I may have experimented with it 20 or 30 years ago, but it's not what I'm about. I'm just a regular artist. Don't characterize me. And then there's that. You could say, well, your stuff's really trippy, and I think it's psychedelic. So I could think it's psychedelic. They may not think it is or want it characterized. It's just art categorizations are. They're like a handy tool. They're like a guideline, It's not a hard, fast rule.
Mm. Do you distinguish between works that are more, like painting and drawing, as opposed to the acid blotter paper or something like that? That some are more ephemera versus, works of art. Are there sort of those almost mini categories in there?
Sure. There's lots of categories. It does come down to some preferences. There's. I'm not sure what the actual question is, though. What are you getting at?
There's just such a variety of kinds of work, within your collection, within the show, that the posters and the sort of more ephemera stuff. Like, would you, the acid blotter paper, there's one cycling through here somewhere with the Felix heads on it.
Right. I like looking at the artistic elements of all the different genres. There are people that, for instance, don't consider graphics fine art, mm-hmm. and there's people that, they're interested in like higher art, like conceptual art or painting, some of the traditional fine art methodologies. And then there's other stuff like exploitation advertising, for instance, which I find pretty amusing. And, I think there's a degree of artiness to it, and I judge things for what they are. I don't like to get too caught up. So my collection goes through a lot of different types of, different genres. I like to look at what I consider the psychedelic content of things and not so much worry about what the format is.
Fred, you had talked once about, with your own work, finding inspiration from conceptualism in terms of a kind of, reaching into almost another plane of existence. Am I getting that right?
Sure.
Was that, I thought it was interesting that you would characterize conceptualism in sort of these psychedelic terms.
You know, well, I kind of got to what I ended up getting to through language. And, you know, language concept is always tied to language, or, you know, philosophy. And, you know, for me, you know, I started, you know, the original sort of ideal, I think, was like pictures were like windows to other realities. And this idea that you could lose yourself in this reality that is represented this inside the picture plane really reminded me a lot of the rhetoric around tripping and psychedelic art. And it also felt to me like it was the big elephant in the room. It seemed like there was a whole lot of artists who had been affected by those experiences, but for various reasons it wasn't really for publication, or it wasn't considered serious, or, you know, it wasn't considered something that you should talk about. And I thought that it was really responsible for not just the shape I was in as an individual, but for the shape that the culture was in, that somehow or another those substances helped get us to where we were. And it was actually when I was at Psychedelic Solution, and there was the Cure of Souls show, which was blotter acid collection that was partially owned by Mark McLeod and yourself. And I just remember looking at these, you know, blotters that contained LSD and thinking about all the inherent power locked up in that paper, and all those experiences that were locked up in that paper. And I started thinking about art as a psychoactive phenomenon, you know, that isn't inherently a psychoactive phenomenon, that it inherently changes perception and alters consciousness. And all art, not just psychedelic art. And that's kind of when that kind of inspired me to start inserting pharmaceuticals and mind-altering leaf material into my work. So language caught me halfway there, but the internal biochemical experiences that hybridized with inside of me by looking through the outside world, all of this hybridity started occurring between the philosophy that comes out of conceptual art, you know, older ideas about like art and art history, and the social world that I grew up in and my own personal experience. So it's kind of messy, and it's not really that smart, you know. And I wouldn't consider, you know, it's a sort of loopy conceptualism that's not so much based on, say, academic, you know, philosophy. It's not like French post-structural ideas. It's not simulationism. It's not situationism. It's basically the deep unhinging that happens with tripping your brains out, and then looking at art history and figuring out a way to put it all together.
Jacaeber, tell us about opening the gallery. What led you to open Psychedelic Solution?
Well, it was, let's see, it appealed to coupled sides of who I am. One was that I was really, I did construction work because I was at my own artwork. I work very slowly. I couldn't earn a living. So I got into construction, figured I'd do art at night. Was too tired at night to do work. After a while, I just said, you know, how can I get back involved with art in some way or another? So the idea was, okay, how about if I don't worry about my art, but I just can start a business related to art and maybe make a living like that. So it appealed to me in a sense of it was a business idea, like, hey, I could get back in the art and deal with art. I'll open up an art gallery. And also, I had been a collector, and I thought, wow, this is going to be the ultimate like spider web here for collecting art. You know, I open up this gallery, I get to go and talk to artists, and I can find stuff, and stuff's going to come in and out, and this is going to be just a big boon to my collecting. So I was real excited about that, and that's, you know, I didn't have any experience or training really in business. I never took a business class, and I don't know if I knew then what I know now. You know, I mean, I made every mistake in the book, but I'm glad I jumped in and just did it. It was, you know, like a kind of like a dream. And then what will I show? You know, I had no connections in the New York City art world, so to speak.
And why New York? Because you're from California.
Well, yeah, I mean, I come from a sort of an art family, but the Bay Area is a place where people make art. There's not much of an economy of art sales there, especially in the 50s or the 60s. So not knowing anything about the art world, I basically started importing a lot of artists that I knew on the West Coast and bringing them out here. I figured, okay, I know all these people in LA and San Francisco. I'll just bring them out here and see if, you know, people get excited by their art. And obviously, I went for the type of art that I like. I didn't ever really think this is going to sell. I wasn't sure at all anything would sell per se, but I stuck with the stuff that I believed in, that I was interested in.
I love that you use the word import. That the idea of bringing art from one side of the country to the other side of the country, it's like bringing it into a foreign country. What was the response like in New York? Because a lot of the artists, at least that you showed initially, were from the West Coast.
Well, it was also pre-internet and all that. Things were much more regional. There were regional art scenes going on. And the people that I knew in the West Coast everybody has this dream of like getting a show in New York. I mean, people in New York don't think about it, but everybody was like, oh, a chance to go show in New York. I didn't tell them the place is not that big, and you know, it's et cetera, et cetera. They were all like, oh, I got a show in New York. You know, I couldn't believe it. I mean, I met Rick Griffin and told him my ideas. It was like a random happenstance thing. I met him in Ben Friedman's poster store in San Francisco. He was looking at some stuff, and I just was like, wait a second, you're Rick Griffin. But after we talked, we had some coffee and we talked about it. He was so excited, and then I couldn't believe it. I was like, wow, someone of this stature doesn't know me from Adam, and he's interested in doing a show. And I tell you, once he did the show, his stature was so great, it went off of his reputation. Robert Williams, Rick hooked me up with Robert Williams, and Robert Williams went for it because it's his buddy Rick just had a show. Everyone was jealous. Rick must know something. He's got this great gallery, and it was like, you know, so Robert jumped in, and then they were like, Rick and Robert, and then it was like, next thing you know was, it just was kind of like, I had pretty much anybody I asked was very excited about it.
And there were lines out the door.
I couldn't have predicted that. Partly that was a fluke of, well, MTV had a lot to do with it also. MTV was really, they were just starting a news service, MTV News, and they wanted to show news, but they had some bit of rock news, and then they weren't sure what else they could have, because they were like, okay, we got a news service, what's news? And a number of the artists that I worked with did work in the music industry. And so they thought, okay, that makes sense, we'll cover the shows. And they just did these little short MTV News segments, but they were on a pretty heavy rotation, and it just really snowballed. It was crazy. We went from we had a few thousand names on our mailing list to like 50,000 names in like a month or two. It was like, and then people were coming in from, I heard about you, we came in from Seattle, or, you know, we had start having, you know, celebrity people come in and stuff, like, oh, you know, blah, blah, blah. It was like, it just kind of blew, it's like the phenomenon, who knows how it happens, it just kind of blew up.
Dan, I know you went to one of his shows. Did you hear about it from MTV News?
That was the only source I had, so of course. You know, I think I read about it, it might have been in Juxtapoz or something like that.
High Times.
Or I wasn't reading High Times then, tragically.
I'm sure.
You were in high school?
I was the first time I went to Psychedelic Solution, I was a freshman in college. fall of '94, and I went to see a friend who was living in near Psychedelic Solution, and that was sort of my first stop, because I'd been collecting underground comics, and I was a huge Rick Griffin fan, and I knew that this was a place I could go to potentially see these artifacts. And at that point, I think it was mostly posters, or at least the day I went, it was mostly posters, and it was pretty mind-blowing to see it all, and especially because these things at the time for me, and this was '94, they were sort of like artifacts from a bygone era. Like now, when I look at them, I think, oh, that was just the other day, 1968 or whatever. But for some reason then, it felt like it was completely unreachable. So me and a couple friends went to Psychedelic Solution, spent a lot of time there. I think I bought a Rick Griffin like reproduction or something, some postcards. It was, $5. And put them on the wall. And then we went and tried to buy acid in Washington Square Park.
Did you score?
Yes, but anyway, it's another story.
I mean, I think the thing that to remember is that those kinds of artifacts, it was a recently obsolete social phenomenon,
That's
so
right.
it was like sort of like it's about as uncool for like a punk rocker like myself as it could get, insofar as that it was representing sort of hippieism, and New York kind of was not that. The prevailing aesthetics were mostly coming out of post-punk at that time. So I mean, in many ways, like it seemed like a very brave gesture to be like putting this stuff out there at that time when nobody was really paying any attention to it in the culture at large. So that I found really inspiring, and I was able to like kind of revisit like all these friends that I had made through head shops, through my adolescence in the '70s, and it was like, oh yeah, fucking Robert Crumb, he's great, and like, just going to Psychedelic Solution and seeing all this stuff all over again, it just really woke up all this, I don't know, sort of vestigial or sleeping sort of aesthetics, and it kind of got me worked up at the right time.
And you moved from California to New York about the time that the gallery opened, is that right?
Yeah, I moved out here in '85.
And did you go to those early shows? Do you remember?
Yeah. I went to the Cure of Soul show. I think that's the first show I saw. And what was that, 88?
Yeah.
Yeah, I think that might have, so 88, so I wouldn't, So, and I don't even know how I found out about it, because I know you purposely kept it on the down low because you were afraid you were going to get arrested for showing drugs.
We did put posters up. We put some posters up.
Yeah, like on telephone poles and stuff.
Like on the wall, on construction sites.
Yeah, but so I don't know how I found out about it. Maybe it was something in the Village Voice.
Carlo, or
maybe
your friends.
I didn't know. I don't know. I knew Carlo, but I don't know if we were buds then. I can't remember, but I don't know how I got the info. But I remember clambering up the rickety stairs to the second floor and seeing this stuff and going, this is unlike anything else that's happening in New York City right now. I mean, I was also going to like, Metro Pictures and all these other, kind of, galleries, primarily in Soho, and seeing a lot of that art as well. But it was such a weird, you kind of planted a flag in such a peculiar place in culture that I was just really turned on by it.
Can I say we didn't open up in one of the established gallery neighborhoods, but also we did not just make this a paean to like anachronistic 60s revival. It wasn't, the second show we had was Robert Williams, and if you're familiar with Robert's work in the 80s, his zombie mystery series, it doesn't read as like 60s hippie at all. It was totally of the time and place. It was very avant-garde, cutting edge, early 80s, LA. And we went on to, soon after that, did Mark Mothersbaugh, H.R. Giger. We did not want to get pigeonholed as just some kind of a hippie revival thing at all. There were a lot of, I purposely only limited the shows to the classic guys that I loved and wanted to show them all to maybe one every 4 or 5 shows. So we were conscious of that. We didn't think New York I didn't think New York was going to be receptive to just like, oh, it's the 60s revival. It wasn't. It was the 80s. But, there's also a way to, you got to pay some homage to your heroes. But we were very aware, it was the 80s. Most of the shows weren't just, relics of the 60s.
And it's funny, when I got turned on to it, I'm pretty sure it was through Juxtapoz Magazine, because that was a big deal for me when I was in high school. Like the first couple issues came out, I think, and it struck me that there was this other thing happening that connected to my love of comics, but it was really, like Robert Williams really blew my mind, and Joe Coleman, and these things that also connected to, it's funny, I mean, MTV makes perfect sense, because Robert Williams probably got the most famous for his Guns N' Roses record cover for Appetite for Destruction.
Yeah, because it got banned.
It got banned, yeah. And I feel like Coleman was on record. Like there was a lot of crossover between music and this sort of contemporary painting that was existing in some area, not in the art world, not in comics, not in just in this kind of like 80s, 90s underground zeitgeist. I mean, there were magazines like Chemical Imbalance, Imbalance, that kind of definitely
Outlaw
Biker, Teen Angel,
Screw. I hate to say it, but
Screw also had good art coverage. Oddly, great covers.
Art Forum to talk about another
sometimes
forgotten publication.
Yeah. So it felt it's funny. It felt like culture in a way that I'm not sure exists at this moment. Things have gotten so diffuse, but at the time it felt like, okay, you would look at this stuff and you'd maybe listen to, or in my case, you'd like listen to Husker Du and Iggy Pop, and you'd be into Charles Burns and you'd be into Robert Williams, and it would all sort of coalesce into some suburban alternative identity, in my case.
What was the relationship with the club culture in New York at the time?
Well,
Fred,
can I just say that every opening we had to have an after opening. So, I mean, it was the relationship that's how I met all the MTV people. They were, partying their brains out. I mean, the 80s was like a super party decade in New York City. So, and before the internet and, affinity groups and all that, people socialized, actually, talked to each other very loud over, music and too many drinks or whatever, but there was a lot of socializing going on in the clubs. People start to get to know each other, and the clubs were great because there was the Bridge and Tunnel days of Friday and Saturday probably, but the rest of the week was the downtown 5000 or whatever. That's what they used to call it, and there was a lot of connectivity came from just good old-fashioned socializing, and there was a kind of some extreme excesses in the 80s. So, we kind of tried to bring that into that. The openings we had weren't cheese with a toothpick and a little glass of wine and leave $1 in the cup or anything like that. I mean, one of our first ones, we bought a microwave and we went to White Castle and bought 1,000 sliders, frozen. And we had sliders, you could nuke your own slider. We always tried to come up with different stuff. It was like one of the only galleries that had like kegs, and then stuff in the bathtub in the back, and, whatever. I don't have to go into everything, but it was, we wanted to, it was like it was very much of the time. I mean, these were parties. We wanted to have parties where people could, get loose and meet. It was a lot about the people having fun with each other too, at least the openings. I think we got a little business done.
People were buying art. Who was buying it?
I remember one of my, I was so impressed when like Iggy Pop bought a piece. I mean, we sold stuff to all kinds of people. It was really a great cross-section of people, but we didn't sell enough. It was a tough business. I mean, you go up and go down and up and down. I mean, I many times stopped and said to myself, I mean, it's been a great ride, probably broke even, I wish we had sold more. I mean, I don't think art started becoming quote unquote monetized heavily, seen as an asset class until around 2000. I think the tech wreck really changed people's perception of art as a commodity, because everything lost value in the tech wreck. Just every asset class except art amazingly didn't, and it just was noticed, and suddenly it was like it's on. But it wasn't so much during our period of time. It was, we sold enough to pay the bills.
Where was coverage taking place? Was it happening in the art magazines? Was it happening elsewhere?
Coverage, we relied heavily on postering the walls. I always loved in the 60s how they actually used posters, and it was a little archaic at that point, but we really liked putting up posters on the walls, and we did big mailings, and we had Carlo McCormick helped me out vastly with our press. We had to have a separate little party, for press people, and decadent little delights to get them down there, because they don't just come down just because it's an interesting art experience. They come down because they're being feted, and it's like they're special people. So we had little parties, and Carlo would tell me, okay, this guy's sympathetic, he's going to like this one's not going to like that, and we'd send out all this stuff. So we tried very hard to get coverage through, applying the press. We did ads in the Village Voice, that sort of thing. So, and then the mailing, we mailed out, like I said, it was heavily reliant on regular snail mail postcards, which I would have, it didn't matter if there had been the internet, I still would have done it, because I'm a huge fan of getting postcards. And I loved getting the ones back in the 60s and wanted to do the exact same thing. It was one of the exciting things about the whole thing. So we sent out tons of invite cards. I mean, that was the invite cards for everything, right? In the 80s, every club had invites. Everything was like a little card.
Yeah. No, I mean, yeah, it's one of the sad facts of contemporary culture that we aren't printing those things up. They're just now PDFs, they just go away,
QR code.
Yeah, I still have collections of old, invitation cards somewhere in a box molding in my basement, but they're great, yeah.
You remember the ones from Area? Oh, weren't those amazing? You'd
No.
get like a box, and there'd be like a nest inside with an egg, and you'd have to look inside a hole in the egg to read the invite inside the egg, and there was conceptual art.
Yeah, I
and
didn't.
Stuff.
I mean, I came to New York, and I went around. I went to Area and Palladium and all those things, and I was like, what did I do? I mean, like, who are these people? So I kind of like ran back to Greenpoint, where I was living at the time, and just hunkered down and made art, and then worked at my day job. So weirdly, like I'd had, sown my, more of my wild oats in Los Angeles, and had gone. And by the time I got to New York, the first thing that occurred to me was that you could freeze to death, in a town like this. So I kind of, it kind of like got myself together, and started working really hard. So even though I was going to your shows, I wasn't really going out so much at night, like I was pretty much working at night. And, but I would try to see as much art as I could, tried to, work my day job, and then worked all night on my, after my job was over, I'd just work all night on my own work. And that's all the energy I had. So I would occasionally go to like a Butthole Surfers show or something, refresh myself, but, I'd see occasional things. But, all my friends were in LA, and when I would go out, like I didn't really know anybody. You know, I was just this like guy, this dumbass from the West Coast. So I just sort of, like, it was weird. It was, I didn't, it was by being kind of cut off from my social scene in Los Angeles, it was allowed me to kind of like really focus on my work and not so much on taking drugs and being out all night and doing all the things I was doing in LA. I took all those experiences and maybe had chances to ruminate about what they meant, and all that wasted time, that, you know, quote unquote wasted time in Los Angeles, I was able to sort of like put it together in some sort of way that made art that I could finally, you know, that I could get behind. I mean, and when I came here, I was an installation artist. You know, I did. It wasn't until I'd gone to Psychedelic Solution and started making drawings and stuff. I had completely abandoned painting and drawing because of the burden of history and all this other stuff. But I found my way back into making paintings or pictures again, you know, slowly but surely.
You mentioned post-punk. Was there a New York iteration of psychedelic art in the way that you would see it being made in California at the time? Was there something in New York too, a sort of different tribe of that?
Well, I mean, the tribe, I mean, what happened to me personally was I'd gone through a bunch of acid in high school, and all the you know, all the kind of the rhetoric around it and the accoutrements of it, and then kind of scrambled my brain for a while, and I wasn't really like, getting along with society very well, and I wasn't getting along with people, and I found, like, I started going to punk shows in '78, and I started finding a tribe of people that like were as fucked up as I was, and that was really a positive experience, and that was really positive until hardcore came up, which, but don't get me wrong, I really like hard, you know, I love Black Flag, you know, I love Bad Brains, but their fans were like the jocks from high school that used to torture me. All of a sudden, they were fellow punk rockers, and the night that, I don't know, it was like 1980, and I was at a Plugs PIL show, and my friend got his nose broken, you know, by skinheads, and it was just such a, it was, you know, like literally a third of the audience was possessed by Satan, and it just felt really fucked up, like in a way that I didn't like. And so that summer of 1980, I just started dropping acid again. And apparently, a whole bunch of people in the original punk scene were also dropping acid because, like, I started going, all of a sudden this Paisley Underground stuff started happening, you know, with like, you know, Green on Red and, you know, all the bands. I'm just blanking out on all the.
The Jellyfish?
I don't remember the Jellyfish. You know, 3 o'clock. You know, so anyway, you know, so there was this neo-psychedelic world, and it formed a kind of a nice, really friendly kind of subculture outside of hardcore. And so I was just dropping acid and going to, going to those shows, that, you know, these sort of like Paisley Underground shows, mostly at the Anti-Club in Hollywood. And I sort of like just, but I didn't, there wasn't like a scene, like, there wasn't like a visual art scene. Like, I didn't know anybody who was making trippy psychedelic art at the time, you know. So, I mean, I just sort of found it in my own way. And I think when I originally started showing my stuff, it was a little outside the kind of dialogues that were occurring at the time, you know, which was more commodity critique, you know, it was pictures art, a lot of scatter art, you know, there was a lot of that sort of stuff, and my work didn't really fit any of that. But, you know, eventually the art world paid a little bit of attention to it.
Can I interject something?
Yeah.
To your question? I think the answer is no.
What? To what?
I don't think there's specifically a New York City psychedelic post-punk aesthetic that you could identify.
Oh, okay. I didn't know.
I think it's It's kind of like there was this postmodernist mashup kind of culture thing going on in the 80s in New York. It's more like you dump a lot of stuff in a Maytag and it was just sloshing around, and there was a lot of gestation going on. Something, you know, hadn't popped out that was distinctive here in New York City. So it would be neat to say, oh yeah, there's a New York City distinctive psychedelic post-punk scene. Not so much, just a whole lot of influences going on. You know, it was one of those periods here. There's probably, you know, you could probably argue that there were some distinctive other areas around that time, but around here, not so much, just like a crazy mishmash of things.
Dan, I wonder if you could talk a little bit about the way that psychedelic art fits into the contemporary art landscape. I think of, for instance, the way that the relationship between comic books and pop, and the way that pop art could take elements from comics and make them into so-called high art, but comics, never really ascend to that. Is there something similar? Because with psychedelic art, because it wasn't at the time covered in a lot of the prominent art magazines. It was in the secondary.
Yeah.
It sprung up.
It's interesting. I mean, when I first moved to New York in '99, I remember thinking there were people like Eric Parker and Christian Schumann making pretty psychedelic work at the time, and even parts of Destroy All Monsters and sort of the latter day iteration of Destroy All Monsters felt like it was definitely influenced by psychedelic art, and it was sort of doing it a bit as well.
And Jim Shaw always.
Jim Shaw always.
Yeah,
Jim Shaw for 50 years.
Yeah.
Ram-LZ.
Speaking of
Ram-LZ.
Right.
So, but I think the sort of hangover of psychedelic art, or the shadow of it, pops up a lot for artists of our generation in the early 2000s, when kind of people that were raised on digital culture, but whose parents had gone through the 60s and had also kind of grown up during the Reagan era. You see things like Paper Rad, which to me was this sort of incredible psychedelic collective. Force Field, coming out of Providence, was also deeply psychedelic, and a kind of melding, like Gary Panter always talks about sort of how he's sort of a punky hippie, and I think that model, the punky hippie thing, you too.
Yeah.
And it's how I kind of, like when I was in 9th grade, I was given a mixtape, and on one side was the Velvet Underground, and the other side was the Grateful Dead. And I always felt like, oh, that's just a natural thing. You're supposed to like them both. But you weren't. But you are. You should. And for contemporary art in the sort of post-2000s era, it felt like people were taking those sort of ecstatic states of mind that they saw in psychedelic art, the color schemes, and also just the permission giving, and making installations and collectives and films. I feel like there was a ton of psychedelic work that came out that was shown at John Connolly and Daniel Reich, a lot of different galleries for about like 5 or 6 years. Assume Astro Vivid Focus, which has just sort of popped up again. Dear Raindrop, which there was a lot of it at Deitch Projects in the 2000s. So that was sort of one part of it. And then I think these days, I think there's a lot more, I mean, for better or for worse, there's been just this incredible surge of kind of light surrealist figuration, that some of which is really, really interesting when it's probing, and a lot of which is not so interesting. But I think a great deal of it comes from people, whether the artist would admit it or not, it comes from the sort of doors opened by like a Robert Williams or a Joe Coleman, or certainly, I mean, there's a Giger show on right now in a gallery owned by like at Lomax. I went to see it, and I mean, the gallerist is like,
it was packed.
It's like 28.
Yeah.
And I'm no one to talk about age, but you know, and Giger is entirely new information for people under the age of 30 because they didn't grow up with Alien, you know, they didn't grow up with any of, when you and I were kids, like you kind of couldn't throw a rock without hitting a Giger book and Tower Records. But in the last 20 years, I don't think anybody's really cared. So I think there's sort of a resurgence now as people are looking for new vocabularies for different kinds of figuration, different kinds of painterly expression. I mean, it's so interesting. It's like right now is the exact opposite of when Fred entered the art world. I mean, the idea of like scatter art is almost cute.
Yeah.
In its non-commercial value and in its actual like deep thinking. Like Barry LeVay died and nobody would like nobody even raised an eyebrow. So it's really an interesting shift. You know, good or bad or whatever. It's an entirely different world. And
do you have a sense of whether artists now are looking back at, I suppose, what I would think of as the more historical period of psychedelic art, the 60s?
Yeah, I think a lot of artists are looking back at it. I mean, I think it's so interesting what Jacaeber did with incorporating Bruce Conner into it, which to me is necessary and right, and also just there are so many, as you know, there are so many other artists like Bruce Conner who could be incorporated into this style. I mean, Jay DeFeo, Wally Hedrick, a lot of these West Coast artists, William T. Wiley, were all deeply psychedelic. I mean, you chose particular mescaline drawings by Bruce and Gene Conner, which makes a lot of sense.
I like that period.
So do I. It's awesome.
You know, Giger had a mescaline period too.
I bet he did. I bet he had a lot of periods. And a lot of rows. Yeah, and I think there's a lot more. And for example, I always think of the story of Ettore Sotsas, who sort of codified the Memphis look coming through the Bay Area I think in the early 60s and meeting artists, and then bringing that psychedelic sensibility back to Italy where it kind of blossoms as Memphis, which then informs the entirety of postmodern design. So I think people are really are looking back, and I think one of the reasons Jacaeber and Fred's show is so timely is that this stuff is finally being re-examined and examined in a more serious way. Like, I mean, I wrote about Robert Williams for Artforum a couple of years ago. There's this Giger show now. There's sort of a little more openness to taking it as serious as it should be taken.
It seems to me like, I mean, that begs the question as to, you know, why? You know, like why now? You know, and it seems to me that, you know, our realities are so totally scrambled with, you know, all these ways of getting information and all these suspect ways of getting information. Reality is very suspect in our day-to-day lives. Like we don't know what's real and what's not real anymore. And it's a funny thing, it's like in a culture or landscape of the unreal, like maybe like an experience generated from inside your body can be one of the realest things in this landscape of utter disbelief that we kind of live in. I mean, there is a psychedelic resurgence going on in culture in general. You know, you mostly read about it, you know, it's therapeutically, you know, for treating traumatic stress disorder, end-of-life disorder issues.
End-of-life disorder.
End-of-life disorder.
That's where you
I'm on my way
to die.
Yeah, I'm on my way to end-of-life. Yeah, I'm living it right now. Yeah. But I mean, it does feel like that there's this moment that's about the scrambling of external reality that maybe has people question, you know, maybe looking inside. And I mean, to get back to your idea about what is psychedelic art, you know, like it's a big thing. I me's like we have all these subcategories of like, you know, we have all these like taxonomies in the show of like, you know, there's the artifacts, there's the underground comics, you know, there's the sort of visionary landscapes, you know, there's the kind of leftist agitprop, you know, there's the You know, there's jazz era cartoons. There's like all sorts of stuff that's commingling. There's this sort of a post-cultural style war that's going on there that kind of predates, you know, like the postmodern sort of, you know, dialogue that's been happening in the art world. You know, it starts with psychedelic art. Like that's where all this melding of all these old forms originally starts in pop culture. But to me, it seems like if you really want to nail it, it's sort of like, it's about like processing external reality through a chemically, cellular, molecular, internally altered reality. And you know, it's sort of like it's being sieved, external reality is being sieved through the mind of agitated neurons, and something new comes out of that experience. And that could be as much, that could be like Yo-Yo Kusama, who she probably took psychedelics, but she claims to have been having hallucinations since the 50s and been making these all over patterns. It's, you know, or Albert Hoffman, the creator of LSD, talks about having visions in the forest when he was 12, long before he created it. It's sort of like these sort of biochemical states that are like altered in various ways. They kind of, that's the sieve that kind of creates this sort of otherworldly work, whether it's drugs or not.
Yeah, I always found it so fascinating. Like Heinz Edelman, who created the visuals for Yellow Submarine, for the Beatles, never did a drug in his life. Because all of that came to him just from working.
Beefheart said he never took drugs either. And
it's fascinating.
Yeah. It's about as psychedelic as
but
music
the
gets.
thing is, Peter Max told me that he sent some sample that he was asked to work on that project and sent over proposal work that didn't come back, and then amazingly they ended up with something very similar. So sometimes people are influenced by other work. It's not that
sometimes,
you necessarily.
Yeah.
I mean, that's one
Peter
of the.
Max is he's a little bit of a Pinocchio. Not that we should speak ill of. He sent those samples that they were after.
We may never find out the exact truth, but he was working in that style prior to that. You know, after he stopped doing the kaleidoscopic work that he was doing with Pushpin, when he had his first acid trips, he started, you could see his work just went in that direction. So I'm inclined to believe the guy. But the point is, my point wasn't so much just that one incident. It's just that you don't have to necessarily take psychedelics. The work itself is influential. I think sometimes the energy that people put into the work with their own energy, it radiates, and you can get the experience in some small level from the work. I think people who never took a drug, to me, everything's a drug. You look at artwork, it's a drug. You eat food or drink or something, it's all a drug. It all is a substance, it's all intake, whether it comes in your eyes, your ears, your nose, your mouth. It's all stuff that comes in and influences us. And I believe you can pick up the vibes right off of a piece of art. You can be influenced. It's hard not to see something after you've already seen it. And so who knows where some of the people got their inspiration from. It could be like Chelachu or whatever.
Yeah, definitely.
You can't unsee something.
Well, I'm of the age where, I'm the post-Altamont, post-Manson acid tripper. Psychedelics had been, they were no longer, they didn't have the kind of utopianism that maybe people in the 60s had. Like in the 70s, it was a different bag. But we had there was still all this like psychedelic and trippy art and trippy music to listen to. And a lot of it was alleged to have been made for people tripping. And so these were kind of like accoutrements that would help interpret the experience you were having. And the thing in the timeline in this show, the things I was really interested in were the things that were made before this was codified into a style. Stuff like from 1963, 64, before it was all out in the world. And people were having these novel experiences and having no kind of culturally defined way of expressing those experiences and seeing all the different kinds of ways that people made art. And they weren't being guided by kind of cultural artifacts, you know, the way mine was. You know, mine was like completely guided by head shop accoutrements and indie record stores, and they were all telling me, this is how you're supposed to trip, this is what you're supposed to be. And, you know, I was really fascinated, like, you know, like if you look at like a Bruce Conner Looking for Mushrooms video from like 1963, 64, it's like, you know, he's doing extremely trippy work at the time when nobody even knows what it is. Tim Leary had to go to Bruce Conner to find out where to get the mushrooms when he went down to Mexico. Because, you know, he was really into his own little, like, just him and a couple of his friends, and that was it, you know. By the time I get it, it's like, you know, LSD had been made illegal, Timothy Leary was public enemy #1, Charles Manson killed all these people. It was a lot of baggage, you know. So I didn't get to have the pure experience. I got the fucked up experience.
But some of them were looking back to antecedents before them, if not strictly psychedelic, but they were looking at Art Nouveau,
Art Nouveau is really
surrealism.
Well, like he just mentioned Bruce Conner in the Looking for Mushrooms. I mean, it owes a lot to Burroughs and Byron Geisen and clip art, and it was this whole, I thought, you know, I keep learning more and more about it during the main period when I was running the gallery. I kind of thought that around 1965 was when this whole thing kind of started up, and over the years, just from, you know, studying the past and looking at work and listening and learning, I discovered, oh no, you know, the real early gestation period of psychedelic art in the United States was from around approximately 1957 to around 65, and as Fred pointed out, it wasn't codified in terms of a psychedelic experience. Some of it was influenced by other art influences, and also by the kind of a lot of the beat era aesthetics, especially by literature, was especially influential. Literature, photography,
like the
and
Yagi
visual
letters
arts.
between like Burroughs and Ginsberg, for instance, you know, talking about ayahuasca. That stuff that was in the 50s. And you had like André Michaud in France doing the peyote drawings, which weirdly look a lot like Bryce Marden's drawings.
And then,
look at them now,
and,
you know.
and the happenings and all the type of work that you know, early USCO and the happenings, those sort of experiential moments where there was this attempt to sort of, I don't know, overwhelm, to storm the gates of the senses with overstimulation, and you know, a lot of it came off of the surrealists and the Dada school and their attempts to you know, induce the mind to let go of convention, et cetera, et cetera. So there's lots of history and influences and stuff. But to Fred's point, yeah, the earlier period is really fascinating. Back when people didn't, you know, there wasn't really a forum for psychedelic art. What I've noticed is that if you worked in that format, your work generally got showed along with other people's work. There weren't places to show back then. I mean, one of the earliest, and this is all the way in a late date of 1965, was Isaac Abrams' small coda gallery here in New York, which only lasted a couple of months. There, you would generally be in with other people that wouldn't necessarily understand your work, and work was pretty much only being published in poetry zines. And interestingly enough, when I go through old poetry zines looking for psychedelic work by certain, you know, certain of the early artists, they weren't even credited. Almost every poem has got a credit as to who wrote that poem, and then there'll be an illustration and no credit whatsoever. So there was not much of a way for psychedelic art to speak for itself in the early, you know, at least in American early period of it.
Let's open up to questions. Do we have any audience questions? Yes.
This is a question for Dan. Since thinking about what Fred was talking about the kind of punk, post-punk, kind of underground music turning its back on psychedelia to some extent. How would you characterize the comic scene post-Zap, especially with Crumb? Like, how does he deal with a kind of, continuing to integrate that as an experience, or turning away any disavowal, things like that?
Oh, yeah. Well, Crumb in particular, I think after a kind of fallow period in the 70s, I mean, he adapted to his need to continue on making comics by taking on a much more, like the best work post-1980 by Crumb is mostly, interestingly, nonfiction or more structured fiction. So he starts, he gets very, very interested in writing and drawing about other people's ecstatic experiences. So one of his best pieces is about Philip K. Dick and Dick's experience with the cosmic, with the, Fred, you would be able to describe it better. But what Valis is based on, the exegesis.
Yes,
thank you.
exegesis. Thank you.
And so he goes in that direction. He does amazing comics about Boswell, about Krafft Ebing, and he also goes deep into his own sex fantasies. But the sort of the psychedelic Crumb, as we knew it, as it was known, is pretty much gone by the end of the 70s. It's a whole different Crumb, and that was to his credit. I mean, I think the work, by moving past it, the work got better and better and better. And then comics in general, it's so interesting because like the cartoonists that were most prominent in the early 90s, like Daniel Clowes, Julie Doucet, Linda Barry, Pete Bagg, and then a little bit later Chris Ware, they really all admired Crumb and took permission from Crumb and took permission from the psychedelic, from Zap and the underground, but definitely tilted more towards a kind of self-consciously or a sort of consciously structured approach to comics making. So Clowes is doing satire and kind of pretty trenchant critique, and also really great, almost like short stories that are very influenced by Nabokov, but also drawing from Crumb, and just in terms of Crumb's bravery and Crumb's ultimate like synthesis of the visual and the narrative, and that sort of incredible thing where neither one is dominant. And I think Bagg as well.
Like raw artists?
Well, Raw, yeah. I mean, Raw happens in 1980 and is very much kind of modeled on telling short stories that could just as easily be published in, let's say, Grand Street or Granta or something like that. It's sort of trying to mold comics that way. But I mean, an interesting thing about comics, especially coming out of that sort of underground dominance, is that there was a huge amount of respect for that work, but also the need to move forward and kind of find a different audience, because the audience of the 90s was like much smaller, because Zap was selling in the hundreds of thousands of copies, and 8-Ball at its peak I think was like, I want to say like 20,000 or 30,000 copies at the very most. So there weren't head shops. It's like Tower Records, bookshops, comic book stores, but there wasn't the kind of mass distribution. So it hewed closer to a literary model, I think, and I think that helped advance the form. It sort of gave people permission to be more ambitious for the form itself, not just their own expression. It was sort of like setting up constraints to then push against them.
And now Mao's is at the center of culture now.
Mao's is at the center of culture
it's
again.
Being banned, and everybody is just buying it because it's being banned.
God bless. It's a
Yeah.
great book.
Other questions?
Yeah.
It's a great book.
A few months after America went through the shock of the Kennedy assassination, it rebounded with Beatlemania. And we are living in a time where America has been through a lot of shocks and has a lot of pent-up tension because of the pandemic shutdown. I have a feeling that something new is going to be born in a few months from now. I'm wondering, how do you see how Generation Z, Greta Thunberg's generation, relates to the psychedelic topic from conversations that you might hear? On one hand, they're very insular, they're very generational, they don't really seem interested in talking to past generations, and are kind of cynical about, you know, everything that went on and left in the world in such a mess. And yet, they're going to be coming of age at a time when attitudes towards the psychedelic are very different. The taboos that were there for so long have largely evaporated. There's scientific evidence of how healing they are and how valuable they can be and insightful. And you know, we're in a whole new climate, and the possibilities are really exciting. I'm wondering what kind of talk do you hear, or what do you see taking form?
I see, I mean, you're talking to an older person about what's happening with younger people, so it's kind of like, but all I can say is from a couple of big psychedelic art events that I attended on the West Coast in the last year, there is a extremely strong interest. I couldn't really speak to whether there's some sort of a movement, but the psychedelic festival people are not necessarily entertainment. I mean, it's not like Coachella. There's festivals and things going on where it's more self-created entertainment. Not geared towards like, oh, we've got to have some kind of like a big band to go to an event, which is very heartening. And the kids that I met, and I'd say kids covers up to like early 40s, but especially the young kids just seem extremely interested, and I know that they're going to do it in their own way. I mean, I'm seeing all kinds of interesting artwork. People are very enthusiastic. A lot of people are taken by Alex Gray and by some of the sort of visionary techniques. So you've got a lot of people working in that mode, and then there's another school which is kind of like Mars One and Oliver Vernon and the kind of further collective people that are working in more abstract fashions. And so there's lots of kids working in an abstract psychedelic manner, but I just see a lot of enthusiasm, and I couldn't say where it's going to go, but it looks good. It's very encouraging.
They're very precocious.
I'm sure they'll come up with their own thing.
They're amazingly precocious. I call them the outspoken generation because they're so good at speaking and very idealistic. So.
They have more access to information than we had. We were pretty cloistered.
Did you have a question?
Yes, question. Psychedelic Solution Gallery archives. Do you have them? Are you keeping them somewhere? Which is something like
I am, and I wish I had some intern type help or something. I've got a lot of it. A lot of it is preserved and kept. Just small details of the shows, photographs, priceless records, press articles, work by the different artists, and digital records of them, and then it's expanded out to a lot of other artists that we're interested in but couldn't find. Where are they? What's their story? What other art did they do? It's slowly, I'm teasing it out, and there's a lot of information, but there's an even bigger pile of stuff that's still to sort through, and it's pretty damn overwhelming. But yeah, I'm trying to keep some kind of physical record.
It's in a safe place.
I would like to see it. It's just a daunting task.
And is there any chance of the gallery like reopening in any way or having a special
I have a fantasy. I don't know about that, but I have this fantasy. I would like to buy one of those little, no-tell, motel type places, the kind of little 2-story place with the swimming pool in the parking lot, and just turn it into a real, like a psychedelic art. You could use the rooms for different little gallery shows. You could have guests that stay there who are, guest artists. You could have people trying to dive off the 2nd floor into the swimming pool. So, but I'm just saying,
You're describing the Tropicana Hotel. Well, it'll be 5 days of Psychedelic Solution at the Outsider Art Fair starting tomorrow. So, so you get that.
I think that's all we have time for. Thank you very, very much.